Unsurprisingly, my content has been significantly changed by recent events with Russia, Ukraine, and with everything associated with Roscosmos. And recently, Roscosmos and the Russian Federation made their move as far as collaborations with the ESA are concerned. All operations, as far as Roscosmos, Soyuz rockets, etc., are going to be brought to a halt in French Guiana, which means all future collaborations between the ESA and Roscosmos in the foreseeable future are now canceled, which of course also means that the ExoMars mission that was planned for later this year almost certainly will be brought to a halt. And that's not the full extent of it. The OneWeb constellation is now in serious jeopardy given that all of the satellites were being launched on Soyuz rockets being deployed by various cosmodromes inside of Russian territory. Sure, maybe Kazakhstan, but as far as that's concerned, it may as well be Russian territory. So there's our update as far as that's concerned, and let's move on to what's happening here in the United States with NASA and with Starship. There have been stories circulating around that NASA is afraid of Starship, that NASA's contractors are their pants over Starship, that somehow Starship represents a tremendous threat to NASA's future plans, their operations, their contractors, that sort of thing, when really this could not be further from the truth. NASA is incredibly dependent on SpaceX, on Starship, and everything that's happening, especially with Lunar Starship. Artemis will not happen unless Lunar Starship, LEO refueling, and everything else associated with the Starship program turns out to be completely successful. And yet, the idea that somehow NASA is being threatened by Starship, probably because Starship is so much more effective and efficient than SLS, for example, is creating a great deal of strife, a great deal of fear over at NASA, and especially with their contractors. And although this may be the case with companies like Boeing, companies like Northrop Grumman, companies that are not embracing reusability and innovation in their future launch programs, these particular companies who have relied exclusively on government lobbyists in order to get their contracts with NASA in the future, sure, these companies may be in a great deal of trouble, but other competitors to SpaceX who are embracing reusability and innovation are in a very good state, in a very good position, and are not afraid at all. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you in just a few moments. So this is the moment that supposedly has NASA officials quaking in their boots, the moment when Starship begins making regular flights from Boca Chica or wherever Starship is allowed to fly from, that LEO refueling becomes a practical and commonplace thing, and Starship becomes a practical vessel. This is the sort of thing that's going to bring all of the rest of NASA's contractors to their knees, bring SLS to a total conclusion, end that project once and for all, and put many people out of work and many companies out of business, or so the story goes. But is that really what Starship is going to accomplish? Well, not in the least, simply because Starship has a very narrow frame of customers that it appeals to. That is to say, customers that want to put a tremendous amount of payload into low Earth orbit orbit, or customers who are willing to wait a considerable amount of time for logistics. Now, don't get me wrong, in many respects, Starship has capabilities that are simply second to none. More than 100 tons to low Earth orbit, 1,100 cubic meters worth of volume, absolutely incredible capabilities, and if you're willing to wait for low Earth orbit refueling, it's capable of carrying this much volume and this much mass to pretty much anywhere in the solar system. But all of this comes at a price. The Starship orbiter itself is absolutely colossal, and it weighs at least 100 tons by itself, and that's because of all of the stainless steel. And on top of that, the booster, the super heavy booster, needs to keep a fair amount of fuel in reserve in order to land again after its initial deployment. So Starship can only carry this massive amount of cargo to low Earth orbit, and that's pretty much it. If you want to carry a substantial amount of cargo beyond that, it requires multiple launches. In many cases, especially if you want to go all the way to the moon, you're looking at 12 or 13 refueling launches. All of this requires, as I said, a lot of logistics. And yes, Elon talks a lot about launching Starship every few hours. Honestly, unless there are star bases all over the planet, I don't see how this is going to be a feasible thing. Launching the largest rocket in history is going to require a tremendous amount of effort, a huge amount of coordination, and the ever-present possibility of launch scrubs. Falcon 9 gets scrubbed all the time, in many cases as many as 4 or 5 times. Now, in spite of that, Falcon 9 is now launching roughly every 7.2 days. That is extremely impressive. However, I think it's going to be some time before Starship can accomplish launches with this kind of cadence. Keep in mind that we're dealing with brand new engines here that have yet to be flight tested. Raptor 2 has yet to fly, and Raptor 1 has yet to demonstrate any reusability whatsoever. I think it's going to be some time before SpaceX can get Raptor 2 and Starship up to the kind of cadence that Falcon 9 has. Now, I think eventually they will. I think they will be able to launch a new orbiter into LEO or beyond every 7.2 days, but I don't think it's going to get a whole lot better than that. Not with all the complications of launching a rocket this gigantic from areas that are subject to all sorts of civilian interference. Now, once they get to the point to where they're launching from off-site oil platforms and that sort of thing, it may improve their cadence somewhat, but it doesn't change the fact that those platforms are going to have to be refueled as well. They're going to have new orbiters, new equipment, everything brought out on a regular basis in order to remain functional. I hate to say it, Elon, but the whole dream of launching every few hours is only going to be possible if there are many, many star bases, and that's going to take some time. But it will happen eventually. But in the meantime, SpaceX's competitors are working very hard to come up with their own kinds of innovation. But before we talk about that, let's talk about SLS. Now let me be 100% clear. SLS is a dead man walking. This is a rocket that has no future. 100% expendable, ridiculously expensive, and utilizing technologies that for the most part date back to the space shuttle industry. And this is why I remain so angry that this rocket has not yet flown. It's not like this is using technology that we don't understand and haven't mastered for a tremendous amount of time, and yet we still face one delay after another, and SLS will not be flying in April either, according to our most recent update, but in May at the earliest, confirming the worst of our fears, and it may get even worse than that. But as far as its capabilities are concerned, it can do things that even Starship can't do. SLS Block 1, the most basic version of SLS, can deliver 27 tons worth of payload all the way to translunar injection with one launch. No other rocket can do that, not even Starship. And it gets even more impressive as time goes on. The SLS Block 1B crew can carry 38 tons all the way to translunar injection, 42 tons for the SLS Block 1B cargo, and then once we get up to the SLS Block 2 cargo, it goes to 46 tons all the way to translunar injection with no refueling required. A lot simpler, a lot more straightforward, and a hell of a lot more expensive. However, until LEO refueling becomes efficient and rapid and the cadence of refueling tankers becomes something that's happening every few days, launching this much payload with one single deployment is still a very attractive thing. And on top of that, SLS is human rated, and the Orion crew capsule has a life support system with capabilities far beyond that of Crew Dragon or anything else that SpaceX is currently designing. And even though I firmly believe that SLS sucks and has no long-term viability whatsoever as far as giving mankind access to the solar system is concerned, Orion is far more impressive. It's completely reusable, it has a life support system capable of sustaining a full crew for at least 3 weeks, as opposed to Crew Dragon, which is 5 or maybe 6 days at the outset. Not only that, you have to keep in mind that Orion is designed to survive a far more challenging re-entry than anything that comes from LEO. Something that re-enters from low Earth orbit only has to sustain a 3,000 degree Fahrenheit re-entry temperature as opposed to 5,000 degrees for anything coming from the moon. And that's simply because low Earth return is about 17,000 miles per hour, whereas lunar return is 24,700 miles per hour. Now, thus far, we haven't subjected Crew Dragon or any heat shield that SpaceX has ever manufactured to these kinds of temperatures and these kinds of conditions. Well, hell, as far as Starship is concerned, we've never tried to have it re-enter the Earth's atmosphere at all. And until we have a system that's capable of doing this, Orion is going to remain the crew capsule for the Artemis missions, and there's really no way around that. Now, I have talked about perhaps using Falcon Heavy to transport Orion out to translunar injection, and although that is theoretically possible, it is going to take Falcon Heavy a considerable amount of time in order to become a human-rated rocket, and also its cargo capacity out to TLI simply is not as great as SLS has, and the later blocks of SLS, the more powerful versions rather, are going to be able to deliver even larger amounts of cargo. So until we have the whole LEO refueling thing down pat, SLS is going to be the only thing capable of delivering Orion plus substantial amounts of cargo in a single mission. And not only that, one also has to keep in mind the whole abort capabilities of Orion that have been tested time and again already. This is a ship that's capable of not only transporting astronauts out to the moon and back, but also keeping them safe in case of some kind of disaster. Starship still does not have any sort of practical abort system, and that's something that NASA is never going to accept. So, Starship may be able to deploy Orion effectively, but for Starship to deliver crew from Earth to the moon and back again is going to be something that NASA probably won't accept for some time. And so Orion, at least, is going to remain a practical and necessary component of Artemis for many years to come. And so therefore, Lockheed Martin is going to remain an important part of NASA's missions for some time to come. Boeing, they're in a hell of a lot of trouble, not only as far as SLS is concerned, but also with Starliner. here. They haven't embraced innovation and reusability as much as Lockheed Martin has, and so therefore they're in a great deal of trouble. Now, Lockheed Martin will also be in trouble once Starship actually has a practical life support system and a reliable abort system built into Starship, but until that actually happens, Orion is still going to remain an important part of NASA's missions. But what about ULA? Well, to be completely clear, if ULA does not get the BE-4 engines from Blue Origin very soon, they are in serious trouble, because although the Vulcan Centaur utilizes some extremely advanced and sophisticated materials that allows it to carry larger amounts of payload not only to LEO, but all the way out to geosynchronous orbit and also to translunar injection orbit, for a lot less money than ULA has ever charged for such things in the past, there's no way that this rocket will ever get off the ground in anything that's going to be a competitive time frame without the BE-4. Where's my engines, Jeff, is such an important phrase now. It's no longer a joke, as I've said many times before. ULA is dead if Blue Origin doesn't come through. However, if Blue Origin does come through, there's a lot of reasons why Vulcan Centaur is going to be able to carry out certain missions for certain customers that Starship may have a harder time accomplishing. Because keep in mind, yes, Starship can carry 100 tons up to low Earth orbit, but that requires an orbiter that weighs at least 100 tons and perhaps a bit more than that, whereas the Centaur 5 upper stage is extremely light, which allows it to carry payloads to geosynchronous transfer orbit and all the way to the moon with one launch for a lot less power, a lot less fuel, and a lot easier logistical coordination than you require with Starship. No low Earth orbit refueling required in order to get these things carried out, but that's not its only advantage. We're also talking about reusability of its engines, called smart reusability, a different approach than Falcon 9, but still there are certain advantages to it. First of all, with smart reusability, you don't need to keep some fuel in reserve in order to land the booster stage. Instead, what you do is just save the engines, which means you can utilize all of the fuel in the booster stage and then recover the engines with parafoil recovery. And by the way, this isn't something that's sometime in the distant future or something along those lines. ULA intends to get started on this year. And by the way, everything I'm about to tell you is per certain sources that I can't quote, can't identify, but as far as I know, everything they've told me up to this point has been accurate, and that's as much as I'm going to say about that. And there's a lot of other things coming out for Vulcan Centaur besides just smart reusability. For example, a third stage utilizing liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, or utilizing liquid methane and liquid oxygen. We're talking around 2027, something along those lines for that, but that sort of third stage allows not only to carry larger payloads out further, but also certain types of payloads can remain functional for a longer period of time. In other words, some of these third stages have mission durations for as long as 3 years. Yes, that's how long it can keep its fuel viable, which makes it very flexible as far as being perhaps a tug or some other type of spacecraft that can deploy multiple payloads into different orbits over the course of a 3-year time frame. Very impressive indeed, and yet not nearly as impressive as nuclear thermal propulsion, which is coming as soon as 2026. Now, please note, these are not proprietary diagrams or anything like that. It simply demonstrates how easily a nuclear thermal engine can fit into the space that an Aerojet Rocketdyne RL-10 fits into. And of course, the RL-10 is designed for the upper stage, the Centaur 5 stage of the Vulcan Centaur. And if you have nuclear thermal capability with your upper stage, you're going to be able to deliver at least double, double and perhaps triple the payload capacity of what you were able to do in the past, which makes long-distance journeys to the moon a much more viable possibility. And in addition to that, ULA is targeting a zero boil-off capability for the fuel tanks for this nuclear thermal engine, along with the third stage proposals that they currently have as well. If you have that low of a boil-off, that means that your fuel remains viable for years, allowing your upper stage to remain viable as a tug or just for a variety of different secondary missions. And these missions might include transporting cargoes to and from translunar injection orbit, or perhaps refueling a lunar fuel depot. That would be an extremely useful thing for future lunar landers, including lunar Starship, which could really benefit from refueling in lunar orbit rather than having to come all the way back to LEO to refuel. You could have ULA and SpaceX collaborating in order to increase our presence on the lunar surface and also with the lunar gateway. So many missions that could be accomplished with the various types of technology that ULA is working on right now. And once again, these are not these sorts of things that are supposed to come up in 10 years or 20 years, but rather on a time frame of 4 to 5 years from now. Very, very aggressive, very innovative, and this is why companies like ULA will remain competitive with Starship. Does that mean they'll be better than Starship? Absolutely not. Starship is going to be very formidable, as will SpaceX, and the reason that everything has become so competitive is because of what SpaceX has accomplished. I'm not trying to take anything away from them, but that doesn't mean that other spaceflight companies are not responding with technologies of their own. If you like this type of content, please subscribe to my channel or check out the description. There's a variety of ways to support me there. So until everybody starts to embrace new types of technologies and reusability in order to remain competitive with SpaceX, instead of simply relying on their powerful allies in Congress, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.